Okay, an appropriate entry music track for one of my favorite games of all time, 1776, by the Avalon Hill Corporation, published in 1974, just a couple years before the American Bicentennial.
Hi everyone, this is Captain Dave speaking to you with my first video from the bunker.
So what I'd like to do is talk about the game, of course, but in addition to that, I'd like to talk a little bit about the history and the strategy that was available to both the American and the British commanders in this period of the war. So let's begin.
So here you can see the major components of the game laid out. It's much longer north to south than it is wide east to west. There really is no place big enough in the house to set it up except for the dining room table. So hats off to Mrs. Captain Dave for allowing us to set it up on the dining room table long enough to do this video.
So I want to talk about some of the quirky rules of the game. Some of these things actually put me off the game for several years because I was only 14 when I first got the game, and it kind of put me off a little bit to playing the game because I couldn't quite understand what was going on. So here's a detailed view of the North-South Carolina border on the game map, and you can see counters of different types. You've got your orange Tory militia, and you've got your green rebel militia. There's also a bright pink. It's a fortification, actually. Bright pink is normally associated with British regulars, but this is just a fort. There are no British regulars on the map. And that is the first quirk that I want to talk about. If there are no British regulars occupying strategic towns, and the strategic towns are how you win the game. If the British can control, I think it's 20 strategic towns, they actually win. So if you're in the Deep South and there are no British regulars, it doesn't matter whether the loyalist Tory militia occupies a town or not. It's not considered, quote unquote, in control of the town. So that means, unless the British regulars show up, nothing much matters in these regions of the Deep South. You can move the units around, you can fight, you can have battles, you can even clear the enemy off the board, but the rebels, the Americans, already control all the strategic towns in the Deep South, regardless of whether the loyalist militia is there or not. And even if you kill all the enemy units, if you somehow pull that off, it doesn't matter, because every quarter you do a reassessment of how many strategic towns are controlled by each side, and you replace the militia units based on how many strategic towns are controlled. So again, it doesn't matter. The British are in control of nothing there. They get a certain amount of units because of that. They spring back to life. So you can spend lots of time here in the Deep South, but it doesn't matter unless you send British regulars down there. So let's talk about where the British regulars actually are in the game. There's a very small contingent of them in Quebec, but almost all the British regulars are located in Boston. The game picks up after the battles of Lexington and Concord. The British have retreated back into Boston and have entrenched themselves there. The Americans are outside the city laying siege, and this is the situation that everybody finds themselves in at the beginning of the game. This is an overhead view of the environs of Boston. You can see the Colonial Army, the blue, of course, and surrounding the city you also see a number of green units. That again is rebel militia, which is probably going to join the siege of Boston in the near future. The one of particular note is the 1/8 Infantry in Springfield. It's currently escorting artillery, and that's the artillery that was captured at Fort Ticonderoga earlier that year and is being escorted by Henry Knox to join the siege. This is a side view of the same thing, and it illustrates the second quirk I'd like to talk about with this game. You can start to see that the stack of units is getting pretty tall. That's quite a tower of units. And bear in mind, the Colonials could have started the game on top of the British regulars, making the stack even taller. I don't think that was a great design decision that they made when the game was produced, but it is what it is, and so I have a workaround which makes the game a little more manageable. So here's what the armies look like if you've got them spread out. You can see the Americans have 18 factors of infantry. They also have a supply unit, which we'll talk about in a second. The British have a little bit more in terms of strength. They have 18 British regulars and 1 Tory militia in the city of Boston, so they have a numerical superiority. They also are behind entrenchments, they also have artillery, and best of all, in my mind, they've got a magazine. The magazine is a very important unit. It doesn't move, that's the downside, but it can provide unlimited supply, and supply is extremely important when you're in combat, because without it, you're fighting at half strength. So let's talk about what should be done here. Strategy-wise, I think it's clear the Americans should not attack Boston. They have less strength points, at least in the first turn, 18 versus 19, so that means they would be attacking at 1 to 2 odds. The British are also entrenched, and the Americans have no artillery support that might overcome that entrenchment. Additionally, the Americans have but 1 supply unit. Normally that's enough to supply an army throughout an entire battle, but it's winter and there are special winter turns here, and that supply unit can only last through 2 rounds of combat for the Colonials. So if there's a 3rd round of combat, they'll be fighting at half strength, a real disadvantage, particularly with everything else going on. And again, the British magazine will give them unlimited supply. I also want to talk about another quirk in the game system, and that has to do with artillery. In this game, artillery is only useful when there is combat that involves either a fortification or an entrenchment, and it subtracts 1 from the attacker's die roll. So what that means is if you're in battle, just in the regular wilderness or anywhere else, as long as there isn't a fortification or an entrenchment, artillery is completely useless. It's actually worse than useless, because as you can see here, the artillery only has a movement factor of 5, as opposed to 7 for the British infantry and 8 for the American infantry. So it can really slow down your army if you're carrying it with you. And again, it only has an impact if you are fighting in a fortification or an entrenchment. And I guess related to that, another type of artillery is the British Navy, which is also in this hex. Now, for instance, at the Battle of Bunker Hill, which has already been fought in this game, it's not just Lexington and Concord, but Bunker Hill has already been fought. And the British Navy in that battle was able to play a part. They were able to bombard the American lines with the cannons on the ships. Not so much in this game. British fleets can have no impact on land combat. And maybe that's okay, because whatever combat they had, whatever effect they had, probably wasn't great. So because the Americans are outnumbered, because of their supply situation, because of the artillery which is there, because of the entrenchments, I think it's a really bad idea if the Americans attack. Conversely, I don't think it's a great idea for the British to attack either. They could move out of the city of Boston and assault the Americans. And I have people on Facebook, and the Avalon Hill group that I'm part of on Facebook, who say that is the way to go. And I have my doubts. And here's the reason why. That the Americans, because of all of their disadvantages, even if they don't have to worry about the entrenchments and the artillery, they could survive the battle. They might not win the battle, but they will probably not be wiped out. And so what, you might say, as long as they take significant losses, that's a win for the Americans. Well, not necessarily. If the Americans survived in any strength on their turn, they could march into the now deserted Boston. There are no zone of control rules here. Nothing will slow them down if they want to do that. And that's actually historically accurate. And I'll talk about that here in a second, because I want to talk a little bit about the history. You might think, well, the Americans can just wait until the militia gets there, but more important, historically what they waited for was for the artillery from Springfield to get there. And in this game, it takes a long time to make that trek. Because remember, they only have 5 movement points. They have to cross a river, and that 5 movement points is only half because it's wintertime. So it takes a long time before they can get there. Now, what you might think you know from history is that once the artillery showed up on the American side, it became apparent to everybody that the British were done in Boston, that the artillery was able to occupy Dorchester Heights and could command the entire town, and the British had no real answer for that. Well, they did have one answer. They could have assaulted Dorchester Heights and tried to eliminate the artillery up there. And in fact, they were going to do that, and there was severe concern that by making that attack in one place, the rest of the Americans would just march into Boston behind them. So what the game represents here about the Americans moving into Boston with a less than perfect attack from the British, that's perfectly valid. That could certainly have happened. But ultimately, the British chose not to make the attack. The reason for that was they were set up to make the attack. They had gathered themselves together, and then a terrible storm brewed up the morning of the attack. The British delayed the attack, and then they thought about it and decided, you know what, it's not worth it. They still remembered what had happened at Bunker Hill the last time they had assaulted, dug in Americans. It wasn't pretty for them. They took tremendous losses. Even though they technically won the battle, they never wanted to face that type of losses again. So the storm gave them pause, and they decided to not make the attack. And something else, which is contrary to what most Americans think they know, is that the artillery showing up on Dorchester Heights is what caused the British to evacuate Boston. Actually, it isn't. They had decided that being penned up in Boston was strategically a bad position for them to be in. That if they ever tried to break out, they were going to have to attack entrenched Americans. They didn't want to do that. They had already made the decision to abandon Boston the previous October. So the artillery, I mean, it certainly had an impact on the British. It probably caused them to speed up their plans. And so they sent word to Washington that if they allowed them to leave unmolested, they would not destroy the city. So it was basically an agreement between the two sides. The British withdrew from Boston to go up to Halifax to plan their next moves. So those are my reasons for why neither the British nor the Americans should attack on turn one. But I think most people come to these kind of YouTube channels because they want to see war. They want to see a battle happen. So let's take the advice of my Avalon Hill Games group on Facebook, and we'll march the British out of Boston, and we'll fight the Second Battle of Bunker Hill, and we'll see what happens. So in a battle, the first thing that each side does is they pick a tactic that they want their army to use during the battle. And in this game, that's represented by these tactical cards, which you can see. The problem with playing this game solo is that you can't pick a card and keep it secret from the other player. If you're the only person playing, you're always going to know what the other side has picked, which other side you're talking about. So the way I handle that is that I developed this random matrix for picking tactics for each of the armies. Now, you could just make it an equal chance for every tactic to occur, but there are sometimes a general would not pick a tactic because it doesn't go along with his strategic objective. For instance, if the British army is attacking and their objective is to destroy the American army, they would never pick the tactic of withdraw. So I weighted this matrix to be very heavily in favor of what it is each army wants to try and accomplish. The American army, because of its lousy supply situation in the winter turn, wants to withdraw, and they want to end the battle as quickly as possible. So they're heavily weighting the results to withdraw or other things which could result in a withdrawal. Whereas the British are heavily weighting their matrix decision to something which will result in the annihilation or at least the heavy damage of the American army. Once each side picks their tactics, it's compared to the tactical result matrix, and that will yield a number, usually, which will be either an addition or subtraction to the attacker's die roll. Now you can see that there's two other results that could be happening here. There's numbers which are highlighted in red, and there's NC. NC means no combat. And that is exactly what it sounds like. There's no combat that occurs, despite what the players may have wanted. And if it's got a red background around the number, it means one round of combat does occur, or that round of combat occurs, but no others. That's the end of the battle. So let's assume the British commander ignores my advice and he marches his troops out of Boston to engage the enemy. Using my randomized tactical results matrix chart, he picks enfilade left, and the American commander picks randomly the most likely choice he is to make, which is withdraw. Well, you can see two things here. That means 0, which means nothing is added or subtracted to the dice, but also secondly, it's red highlighted, which means that round of combat will take place, but that's the only round of combat. Switching over to the combat results table, the British only have a 1-to-1 ratio of forces, so they use the 1-to-1 column in their roll of 5, DL1. That means the Americans lose 1 strength point from their stack of units. Not hardly a decisive result. So what happens next? Well, that's the end of the Second Battle of Bunker Hill. The British are now outside the city, and on their turn, the Americans can now move into the city, capturing the magazine which is in there. That's a problem for the British, because now the Americans have infinite supply if the British want to try and retake the city. Even worse, the British are now out of supply, so sure, they can attack on their turn and try and regain the city, but now they're at half strength, because they don't have any supply units. They were drawing supply completely off of the magazine in Boston. And you might say, well, Captain Dave, that's just because of the randomness of the tactical results matrix which you imposed on the system. No human player would be so stupid as to be able to force a withdrawal in a battle like this. And I disagree, because all the Americans have to do on any round of combat is pick withdrawal, and that's the end of the battle. There's no other result which can happen. There are other results which can result in the end of the battle happening, except if the British only pick frontal assault. But if they only pick frontal assault, the Americans are going to pick up on that, and they're going to start picking tactical options which give them the absolute best advantage on the die roll, because they know what's coming. So sooner or later, the Americans are going to either win the battle or withdraw from the battle, and then Boston is lost and the British are going to be out of supply. And there's no way they can avoid it unless they do something strategically much different, unless they withdraw their forces or they just wait a few turns until reinforcements show up in Boston. Because coming over the horizon of the Atlantic Ocean, there are massive British reinforcements coming. So, assuming the British commander takes my excellent advice and sits on his butt in the city of Boston awaiting reinforcements, let's check out what else is happening around the world. So, first off, we should go up to Quebec. I mentioned that earlier. That's where there is a small contingent of British regulars, along with a fairly large amount of Tory militia. There's also an American army up there, made up of regulars and militia, besieging the city of Quebec. Historically, you probably know that siege came to nothing, and the Americans had to withdraw. So it's almost the same exact situation as Boston. Neither side really should feel comfortable enough going on the attack, so both sides, well, the British should just defend, and the Americans, they've got a little bit of a problem. It's a stalemate right now, but British reinforcements are coming, and some of them are coming specifically for Quebec. In March, once the ice thaws, the British will be sailing down the St. Lawrence with reinforcements for their garrison there. So the best American strategy is to get the heck out of Dodge. They're going to withdraw all their forces down to Montreal. Before we move on from the British first turn, I want to talk about the militia situation in upstate New York. British have a fairly strong unit, a 3-8 unit off of Lake Ontario in Oswego, New York, which can move down into New York to assist the regulars. In addition to that, there are 3 1-8 units representing the British Crown's Indian allies in upstate New York. These units operate independently of the militia rules. They're never increased or decreased based on the amount of strategic towns controlled. They're in addition to regular militia. The downside with the Indians is that they're fragile, that once they're destroyed, they never come back. So that's an advantage that the British have that they may not keep past the first battle. So here's what it looks like at the end of the British turn. The Tory militia has moved up to threaten a 1/8 unit in a fort at Fort Stanwix in New York, and the Indian allies are gathering safety in numbers after all. And here's what it looks like after the American first turn. The units from Quebec have withdrawn all the way down to Montreal. They're under entrenchments and they've got a magazine there, so they're going to be well supplied if the British start to march down the St. Lawrence. And here's what it looks like in New England at the end of the American turn. The militia is starting to gather. A 2/8 unit has already joined Washington's army outside Boston. The 1/8 unit escorting Henry Knox's artillery has barely made it over the Connecticut River. The winter weather is really slowing them down. Remember, the artillery moves at only 5 hexes. It's winter, so they only get half of that, which is 2 points. It's actually rounded down, so the 2.5 becomes 2 movement points in winter. And they had to cross a river, which costs an additional point. So they moved a grand total of 1 hex in this turn. So it'll be a couple more turns until they can also join the siege in Boston. So that's it for turn 1 of 1776, a great war game from the Avalon Hill Corporation. Before I close out, I'd like to end with a recommendation for 2 books where I learned a lot of what I know about the American Revolution. Rick Atkinson's The British Are Coming and Dave McCulloch's 1776, both of which are excellent reads, which I hope you people will enjoy. So that's it. If you like the video, please hit like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time for turn 2.